Now resume.
Mr. Commissioner, I have Mr. Harvey up next.
Christopher Harvey for the Area G Trollers and the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. Ms. Farlinger, there's a perception amongst those I represent that the root problem with the wild salmon policy is not so much its wording, but the fact that the wording bears no resemblance at all with DFO practice. And I'm referring to, in this regard, to Objective 3 and Strategy 4. Objective 3 being the objective which calls out page 14 for socioeconomic benefits to be considered, fisheries-dependent communities to be considered and involved in decision-making, and Strategy 4 being the integrated strategic planning process. Now, I would like to, just to be sure I've got this right, understanding your evidence, to refer you to the transcript for December 16th at page 27. This passage on page 27 follows Mr. Timberg referring to certain pilot projects involving wider consultation, and then at line 30 you give the answer. You say this: the multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, First Nation, multi-level of government groups that are contemplated in Strategy 4 do much of the work and guide much of the work in terms of Strategy 1, 2, and 3. Now that's what you say, and then dropping down to the next paragraph you say, now when we talk about pilots, what we're trying to do is figure out how this is going to come together on a watershed basis. Things come together in a different way in different watersheds. They're somewhat organic. They depend on the population and species of salmon that are there. They depend on the First Nations, organizations and groups that are there, and harvesting groups that are there, the environmental groups that are there. So that's the vision of a wider consultation that involves community groups and multi levels of government in the sense of federal, provincial, regional district, municipal, and First Nations.
I wouldn't describe it as the vision. I would describe it as the process through which the Strategy 4 groups are coming together.
That's all right. Now, if I could refer you briefly to Exhibit 267, that's the document titled Framework for Improved Decision Making. Is this, does this describe the beginning of this process of involving watershed groups or wider groups in decision making?
This document, as you can see from the date, focuses on engaging a broader set of interests. It does not specifically go as far as dealing with the issues of implementing the wild salmon policy, which focuses on working with all the interests on a watershed basis, rather than this document, which is somewhat more focused on the coast-wide salmon fishery and the various processes that come together to support coast-wide decision-making. One of the significant challenges we will have in bringing people into the Strategy 4 type process is looking at the linkages between what is largely described as the annual decision-making process and the longer-term strategic plan for a specific set of stocks in a watershed. And one is somewhat longer term. They clearly will interact with each other.
You're aware that this document, Framework for Improved Decision-Making, refers to an Auditor General, this is at page 4, the Auditor General commenting about the need of the department to improve processes for consulting with the province of British Columbia, with stakeholders and with communities. You're aware of that?
Yes.
And towards the end, at page 20, there's a reference to the first pilot and project, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Aquatic Management Board. You're aware of that?
At that period, that was certainly one of the pilots that had come forward as a proposal to the department, and that would be why it was mentioned there, yes.
And part of the impetus for this was the Oceans Act, is that right? I can refer you to Exhibit 263, which is another one of the exhibits Mr. Timberg put in your evidence.
Yes, certainly part of the impetus for this was the Oceans Act and the strategy under the Oceans Act, yes.
For example, if we look at page, this is Ringtail 004. This is part of the minister's opening words in the upper right-hand paragraph. He says, "We are now seeking to implement this strategy through further collaboration. The sustainable development, integrated management of our oceans requires the help and ideas of local communities, industries, Aboriginal peoples, provinces and territories, environmental groups, and other interests." Now,
yes, I'd point out that this policy document, I believe, is somewhat later than the consultation document that you were initially referring to. And in fact, our activities under the Oceans Act of integrated planning are focused at a much higher level than the operational or regulatory planning that we do in the process that's referred to in the first document. But clearly the crossover between integrated processes and processes that are very focused on harvest management is one of the challenges in front of us.
Are you aware that there have been requests made in the course of this inquiry for socioeconomic reports indicating the impacts to communities up and down the coast of DFO policies?
I'm not aware of that specifically during this inquiry, but certainly those issues are discussed both in the integrated fishery planning process, the one reference from the first document, and also in the evolving watershed multi-stakeholder processes. So we're familiar with the fact that there is an interest in and support for those analyses. In some instances, they have been done. For example, there was an economic analysis in the Skeena River looking at the impacts on the gillnet fleet. So there are individual examples of these, of some analyses that have been done, but there's certainly a greater demand for them than
yes.
there are studies that have been done.
Yes. There's, I'd like you to, if Mr. Lund could bring up Exhibit 480. This is a socioeconomic review done or prepared for the New Channel Tribal Council by a consulting firm, and it discusses the West Coast Vancouver Island Aquatic Management Board, page 5, but it has a graph at page 19 showing the dramatic impacts in this area.
This is tab 9, I think, in the documents that Mr. Harvey provided.
Yes, thank you. That graph probably come as no surprise to you, shows the dramatic changes in the west coast of Vancouver Island in the pieces harvested in sockeye equivalents, landed values by the troll fleet. Do you see that?
Yes, I see the graph.
So the socioeconomic impacts of this are discussed in other places by the West Coast Vancouver Island Aquatic Management Board. Is that a board which you consider to be of value in the consultative process?
The mandate of the West Coast Aquatic Board has been a subject of discussion between DFO and the board, initiated by the New Chalith in around the year 2000. The mandate of that board has been focused on planning, habitat, and in fact, we have referred the board on a consistent basis to the integrated harvest planning process as the place to discuss fishery management and fishery allocation matters. So this board is somewhat differently focused in the same way I talked about the difference between the Oceans Act policy document you put up a few minutes ago and the consultation framework, which is the first document you put up. The focus of the board, as agreed to in terms of DFO and its regulatory activities, is on those broader integrated planning issues, rather than specifically on the management and allocation of the fisheries.
Well, that's because that's DFO's decision, not the board's decision, isn't it? Because the board itself is very concerned with the socioeconomic implications of fisheries decisions in the West Coast Vancouver Island area, is it not? To your knowledge?
It certainly seems to be in this document, yes.
Yes. Well, don't you think it would be a more appropriate consultation? Well, you say that document. Let me refer you to one other document first, and that's Exhibit 502, which is a Standing Senate Committee report. And at page 30 of that report...
This is tab 12 of the binder.
Thank you. At tab 30 of that report, there's reference at the bottom of the page. The committee heard testimony that years of federal policies have shifted fishing licenses out of rural and Aboriginal coastal communities, the result being that few now see economic benefits from the fishery resources adjacent to their shores. Witnesses spoke about frustration, despair, and the depopulation of communities. On the west coast of Vancouver Island, where there had been a number of community fishers involved in commercial fishing, this is no longer the case. Committee members learned that whereas there had been well over 200 licensed vessels operating by New Chalith in the 1950s, there are now 16 vessels remaining in communities where unemployment rates vary from 70 to 90%. And then over the page, there's a table setting out the loss of commercial fishing licenses in various rural communities all up and down the coast. Are you aware of this report by the Standing Committee?
I was not aware of this particular report, although I'm certainly aware of the opinions and the information presented in the report. I think that I would say that there are a number of reasons for this shift, and far more perhaps than may be addressed in this particular report. individual license holders may or may not have retired their license during the period in the late 1990s when the salmon fishery was reduced by half by the both what was referred to as the Mifflin Plan, in which there was a license retirement, in which holders of licenses could provide those licenses to be retired
I think Mr.
be
Wallace,
given funding for them.
I think Mr. Wallace is about to say this is off topic, and I would agree. My questions go to the consultation. My questions go to the consultation mechanism and structure in the wild salmon policy. And my question is this, that the socioeconomic implications and the effect on communities of DFO policies is necessarily something that is best dealt with and the evidence best developed in terms of regional boards, area boards, or watershed boards, if you like to call them that, such as this West Coast Vancouver Island Aquatic Management Board, are they not?
There are a number of layers of decisions that are made around, in the long term and the short term, around the salmon fishery. Salmon, as you know, have historically been harvested all over the coast. The changes we talked about earlier in terms of, firstly, the limitation of the number of the licenses in the fishery, the changes in the area-based licensing in the fishery, and the reduction of the number of licenses in the fishery are based on conservation requirements. The number of aspects of the wild salmon policy are based on conservation requirements. A number of changes in where those salmon are accessed, whether further out at sea in mixed stock fisheries or closer into the river when they've separated off into more discernible units, is part of a suite of conservation measures that have been occurring over the last fundamentally over the last 20 years or longer, in order to achieve conservation objectives. Also, I think in the matter of the wild salmon policy, the kinds of groups that we are working with, if you were to look at exactly this same area, includes the participation of the West Coast Aquatic Board, but also includes commercial fishers, salmon fishers from that area, recreational salmon fishers from that area, and First Nations from that area. So the board is not excluded from these processes related to the wild salmon policy, and is in fact engaged in helping to set up the process around this pilot process in Barkley Sound. So if by it is of and by itself not sufficient to consult on and the broad range of interests.
Would you agree with me that there's been political direction from the minister at various times since the one we looked at earlier, I think was 1999 or 2000, at various times up to the present, direction to the DFO to ensure that communities are involved in the co-management and consultation structures. I can refer you to some statements in this standing committee report if you like on that. At page 30, for example, or 38, I should say.
Perhaps I could respond to this and briefly deal with the question you've raised earlier. I think my response is the departmental advisory processes that it's set up do actually involve community members that participate as fishing interests in those advisory processes. So what are those advisory processes? Well, we have a South Coast integrated advisory process to develop fishing plans for the South Coast. So why wouldn't you have just one for the West Coast, which was your argument, I think, or your point?
Well, my point was this, that the communities, and the general evidence that we've heard so far indicates fishing license holders being included, as they should be, but the communities are not included, and the socioeconomic impacts on communities are not properly brought into the decision-making process.
I'm not sure that's quite correct. I think there's an argument for strengthening the community input, but I don't believe you're correct in the way you've just characterized it, that they're not consulted or not involved. I thought you made the point that it's the local communities who are directly affected and therefore should be consulted, and whose opinions should influence fishing development and fishing plans and DFO policy. But I think there's two issues you need to appreciate. The reality is, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, with the exception of Barkley Sound sockeye, almost all of the fish harvested on the west coast, for example Chinook, don't spawn on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They spawn in the Fraser River, in Georgia Strait, and the United States.
No, Mr. Sprout.
No, just let me finish my point. You raised this point about local involvement. And so if you think about how Pacific salmon behave, would you want a West Coast group to be deciding outcomes for fish that actually spawn in an entirely different location? What about those other people who live on the banks of the rivers where those fish spawn? Shouldn't they be consulted as well? And I think what the department tries to do is to create an integrated planning process that brings the affected interests together, not just one party, but all the parties. And the other point that I think is relevant here is the department controls license holders. It issues licenses. But it doesn't tell the license holders, you must live in Bamfield. You must live in Ucluelet. You must live in Vancouver. If the license holders decide to move from Bamfield to Vancouver, or from Vancouver to Bamfield, that's the license holder's choice. Now, some argue that the licenses should be constrained to areas. That's an interesting observation, but that is not the current policy. So I think these two factors are relevant in looking at what kind of processes you put into place for consulting on the development of fishing plans and its implications.
All right. So the adjacency principle referred to in the Oceans Act and the reference to communities in the Oceans Act is something that you place little weight on, I take it from that answer.
No, and I think you've mischaracterized it.
All right.
The adjacency principle arose principally through East Coast concerns about local operators fishing close to inshore areas. The principle emerged through that, and I would argue that the principle is being respected in how it's being applied in the West Coast. How? And why is that? Well, the answer is it respects how fish behave. Pacific salmon are highly migratory. As a consequence of that, when you create advisory processes, you have to bring the interests all together that are affected by the very behavior of the fish. When you have more sessile species that do not migrate, like for example clams, then you can have very local processes with people in the local area. And if you look at DFO's clam advisory processes, what you discover is that they are in fact local, principally involving the people in that very area. But as you move to more migratory species, Pacific salmon, halibut being the most migratory, then you move to processes that necessarily must have a wider geographical area to include the interests that are affected.
Mr. Sprout, what do you take fisheries-dependent communities, as it's used in page 14 of the wild salmon policy, to mean? Doesn't that mean the communities up and down the coast that historically have been dependent on the commercial fishery?
I take it at face value. I take it at communities that have fishing interests where fish resources benefit those communities. And my view is that that includes a very wide range of communities.
All right.
on the West Coast. But you know, it also includes Prince Rupert, and it also includes Vancouver. The largest facilities for processing of fish, which creates enormous labor, exist in Vancouver and in Prince Rupert. So those communities of interest in Steveston and Prince Rupert are highly dependent on fish in their very local community,
Yes.
as are other communities outside of Vancouver and Prince Rupert.
Yes. Ms. Farlinger?
Yeah, I think the other issue here that's a bit confusing is under the Oceans Act. This is about the involvement of a much broader set of interests in terms of setting the framework for any regulatory activity, whether it's Transport Canada regulating shipping, whether it's DFO doing its regulatory work around harvest or habitat. And it is an integrated planning process, which is a very different thing from a harvest planning, allocation, or access planning process. And once again, when you look at the watershed-based processes that are contemplated in the wild salmon policy, these are another thing again. They are the same sort of process that's contemplated in both those other two, concentrated with interests at the watershed level. And as I said earlier, the West Coast of Vancouver Island Aquatic Board is engaged as one of the partners in the development of this pilot program on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So it really is important to differentiate between the objectives of the minister's authorities and responsibilities under the Oceans Act and the responsibilities under the Fisheries Act and the kind of process we contemplate to meet our requirements under the Fisheries Act in the wild salmon policy. They happen at different scales and they happen at different levels.
Yes. All right. And to be fair to you, Ms. Farlinger, the Aquatic Management Board was also consulted with respect to the impacts of the 2009 reduction imposed by the Pacific Salmon Treaty. Just to put this in context, the commercial trawlers suffered a 50% roughly reduction in their Chinook harvest as a result of a Pacific Salmon Treaty agreement. Is that correct? And there was a $30 million fund provided for mitigation that was referred to the Aquatic Management Board.
Mr. Commissioner, I question the relevance of this. Mr. Harvey's just said that settlement is about Chinook, and that's not the species that we're dealing with today. And as I've objected previously, Mr. Harvey's going towards the Komodo litigation, where he has been the counsel that's now at the Court of Appeal, and I don't see the relevance of the settlement funds from the Pacific Salmon Treaty as being relevant to the terms of reference before us today.
All right. Well, my question was directed to the consultation process and the socioeconomic impacts on communities that's referred to in the wild salmon policy. And I'm assuming that the same processes would have been followed if it were sockeye. So in other words, it's the processes that I'm asking about, not this particular example. But the example is a good example, I would suggest, of how the community impacts are entirely disregarded in the decision-making processes of the department. That's the thrust of the questions. And I should say, this is the thrust of my questions overall, is that the wording of the wild salmon policy is one thing, and it's largely unobjectionable, but it's the practice that is entirely different that is objectionable. And surely a concrete example is the best way to test it.
The process you describe was an extraordinary process, which happened from time to time around changes and actions that the department is going to take. So this is in addition to the wild salmon policy processes, which are focused on conservation and biodiversity and the potential domestic decisions that are made around that. and is also different than the integrated harvest planning processes. And to answer your question directly, yes, the West Coast of Vancouver Island Aquatic Board was part of that consultation.
I'd like to add, I don't agree with your perspective that the department didn't consult the communities in the decision ultimately made by the Government of Canada to reduce the Chinook harvest in order to conserve Canadian Chinook and also to conserve American Chinook harvested in both the United States and Canada. You argued, or you have pointed, you have made a point.
My question was not with respect to the reduction, but with respect to the economic impacts on the sector that was affected by the reduction.
Can we just contextualize this a tiny bit for the audience so that they can follow?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to object to my friend pursuing this line of questioning. It's with respect to Chinook salmon, and it's with respect to a settlement fund or an agreement of $30 million that I don't see the relevance, and I think it is confusing. And to then allow the parties to go down this line, I don't see that it's relevant to the terms of reference.
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I'll move on in the interest of time. Mr. Sprout, if we could look at the transcript again, Mr. Lund, page 63 of the transcript of December 16th. Mr. Sprout, at line 32, you refer to, you were asked whether you have recommendations. This is, I think, Mr. Rosenblum asking you whether you have recommendations to the Commissioner. And then you say this in your answer, well, I do. I wouldn't, first of all, let me just correct your impression of how I'm feeling. I feel passionate about Pacific salmon and about wild salmon policy, and this is an opportunity for me to express that. I'm not frustrated. This was an opportunity. I'm here to express as well as I can my understanding of how well we're doing, and I will provide advice where I'm able to in areas which I think I have expertise. And so with regard to your question, on the recommendations, this is page 64 now, recommendations relative to this, I've suggested a couple of areas. One is, these are along the lines of dealing with others that are outside the department that I think are relevant in the sustainability of Pacific salmon. And my view is that we need to create watershed processes that are led by those agencies who have responsibility and legal responsibility for the management of water and use of land, and that those exercises, those watershed processes, need to look at planning human development. We need to confront the issue of where we want to live, et cetera, and then you say, regrettably, the federal policies don't get at those issues. And therefore, I have suggested that one of the things in terms of going forward would be developing watershed-based processes that are led by those that have jurisdictional responsibility. Mr. Sprout, my question is, what do you mean that there are no federal policies in place? Isn't Canada's Oceans Act strategy that we looked at earlier a policy? And isn't the preamble to the Oceans Act a policy? Isn't that enough?
No, it's not. And just to be precise, what I was referring to here in the context of the wild salmon policy was how you can move forward on Strategy 4, and particularly how you can deal with some of the threats that I believe are going to be very important for Pacific salmon. And I think one of those threats is climate change, and how that's being realized, I think, in watersheds, particularly in the south, is water management. I think the availability of water for Pacific salmon is going to be a very crucial issue for the future. So I'm thinking down the road. So the issue is, who controls water? What are the jurisdictional levers for water? Does the federal government control that? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't. That is provincial jurisdiction that involves regional districts. So what I was saying here is federal policies and regulation, I don't think, will get at this question of climate change in the context of fresh water. I believe that in creating watershed processes that have to be led, in my opinion, by other agencies, but which DFO would participate on, that these processes need to look at how to manage water scarcity, what to assign to fish versus what to assign to humans or industry. And that's what I was getting at here.
But Mr. Sprout, those processes would only be beneficial if DFO gave them some weight and they took a meaningful part in DFO decision making, wouldn't they?
What do you mean?
Well, if the processes are in place and a wide-ranging consultation through those processes occurs and DFO ignores it, that would be of little value, wouldn't it?
I'm not following what you're saying, but I'm going to
All right.
try this. If the DFO can only go so far, it can only go legally based on the regulations and law that it has. It can create policies or approaches, but what it cannot do is say that when it comes to water management, that I'm going to assign some volume of that water to fish, and I'm going to assign some volume of the available water to human consumption. I'm going to assign some available volume for industrial use, like hydroelectric development. DFO cannot do that. So what I'm suggesting here is you have to create something else and give it the authority to make those choices. And I'm arguing that those should be some sort of watershed-based processes which DFO participates on but does not lead.
But are you saying that those sort of processes should not be utilized to determine the socioeconomic impacts of DFO decisions?
Are you talking about the social and economic impacts of fisheries or habitat? What are you referring to?
Of decisions made by DFO managers.
Okay, so the managers are typically making decisions about fisheries. So are you talking about fisheries?
Yes, I'm talking about the sort of decisions that DFO managers make, and I'm particularly aiming this question at what seems to me to be a deficiency, and in the perception of my clients is a gross deficiency in the socioeconomic impact information that DFO appears not to give sufficient weight to, possibly because it doesn't have the socioeconomic analyses or the other data to form the basis for the decisions.
Okay, you seem to be talking about fisheries. Now, I just want to put this transcript to bed. When I spoke in the transcript on December the 16th, when I talked about sustainability or watershed governance, water management, I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about literally trying to decide how to allocate water. And in this instance, I'm saying DFO can't lead those processes. It does not have the jurisdictional responsibility, that those groups that do are the ones that should lead and DFO should participate. Right. Now I'm going to answer your other question, which I think is different.
Mr. Sprout, I wonder if it's 12:35, if you can hold that thought, which I'm sure you can, and if we could resume at 2 o'clock.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.